So tonight I'm going to talk to you guys about using human remains detection dogs in archaeologic investigations. I am a visiting professor at Texas State, and I run the canine training program at the Forensic Anthropology Center. I started doing research. My degree is in soil science, forensics. I don't know how to plant roses or grow cotton. Okay. When I was doing my graduate work, Dr. Westcott would have a big fat lab laid in his office all the time. And I took a chance and asked him, because I was a canine handler, if he would consider letting us do a seminar. And that's how the training program evolved. And I run a 501c3 called First Detection Canine, which trains scent detection dogs, places them, and we do more than just this. We also do work with conservation and other scent detection disciplines. I started the search and rescue in 2000 with a German Shepherd. In 2003, I was given this dog. He was a 9-week-old, very ornery border collie puppy, and he's what got me started down this road. He's actually what caused me to go to grad school. I wouldn't have gotten my master's or my Ph.D. without this dog. Pete and I did a lot of stuff, from disasters, homicides, and did a lot of water recovery. So why do we use dogs? Well, they can smell a lot better than what we can. If you walk into a bakery, it smells good. If you took your dog in the bakery, he could parse out the flour and the sugar and the butter and the milk, each individually. Okay. When it comes to human remains detection, we believe, we're not 100% sure, but we believe that they detect fatty acids, sometimes in the state of adipocere, but also just recalcitrant fat that fat gets to a point, or we're finding that fat gets to a point in contemporary graves that it quits breaking down. The microbes have done all they can do. And those chemicals leach into the rock and the soil, and we believe it can be trapped there for thousands of years. So the VOCs get spread in the groundwater in the path of least resistance. Depending on the type of soil the dogs are looking in, it can be easier or more difficult. We know that the chemicals travel down slope. We actually did research over at Sam Houston State University at their outdoor decomposition facility, and were able to trace chemicals down slope from where the bodies were at. A lot of times when dogs are working cases in areas that are mountainous, you may not get alerts where the body is. If it's downhill or upslope, you're going to get the alerts where the most odor is, and sometimes if it's been raining, that's going to be downhill. Dogs aren't trained to find bodies, they're trained to find odor. We've also shown through some research that something, you don't know what it is being picked up by certain plants and trees. And if you take dogs that are pretty proficient at locating graves into especially old graveyards, and on clandestine graves, on actual cases, they tend to alert on vegetation instead of where the actual burial is. Cadaver dog teams, it takes a lot to put one together. You have to have the right dog. You've got to have a dedicated handler. You got to have training aids. The dogs have to be certified, or they should be certified. There are handlers out there that don't do that, but that's not what most of us do before they ever get to the point where they search. Training aids can be a big problem depending on what part of the country you live in. Certifications, when I first started, was a lot harder to get, which was bad, but it was also good because if you wanted it, you had to work for it. And you might have to travel to get a certification, or your team might have to do a fundraiser to bring somebody in. Unfortunately, now there's so many certification agencies that you really have to kind of look at the agency, know who the members are to determine the worth of the certification. And one of the things that I do at Texas State is make sure that anybody that comes into that facility is appropriate. And that includes not someone that's going to try to snatch any training aids while they're there. Okay. So the traditional methods up until now of training cadaver dogs or HRD dogs has been using what they could get their hands on. Placentas. That is something that anybody can get in almost any state. It's not a good training aid, but it's something people can get. Blood, also not a great training aid. Teeth, it can be okay, especially if you're going to be working code cases. Bone, the only bone that is available to most cadaver dog handlers is purchased online, either through the Bone Room or Skulls Unlimited. It's getting harder and harder to get decent quality bone. And what I mean by that is bone that is not bleached and hasn't been handled by 10 million people. Or donations. Unfortunately, the donations are usually placentas. Now in Texas, we're lucky. 5 years ago, we got a law passed where 501c3 teams, which is the way Texas search and rescue teams work, can obtain training aids through the Will Donor Program in Dallas or Fort Worth. And that for the teams that are willing to jump through the hoop, like my team, it's been a game changer because the dogs are actually able to train on what they actually have to find out in the field, which are, we don't get whole bodies, but we do get arms and legs and sometimes other parts if we request them. So what do you need to train one? Okay, can any dog do this? No. You have to have the right dog. Okay. They're kind of like police dogs, they're not like pets. Most of the dogs that are good in search and rescue, probably most of you guys would not want to live with them. Okay. They've got to be genetically healthy. I don't want to put 2 years of training into a dog and my heart and soul, and then find out the dog has hip dysplasia. These guys have to be courageous and fearless because we never know what kind of environment we're going to put them in. I prefer to work with dogs that are highly motivated by toy, not food, because food dogs tend to shut down if it's too hot, if they're sick to their stomach because of travel, if they pick up a stomach bug. So I would prefer to work with a toy dog. You also don't contaminate scenes if you're working with a dog that's rewarded with a toy versus food. And they have to have stamina. And the most important thing to remember about cadaver dogs is that they're trained to find odor. Okay, they're not trained to find bodies, they're trained to find the odor of human remains. How we train them? We train them with a positive association. Their target odor means they're going to get the reward. So when they smell their target odor, the toy is going to come to them. We don't use pseudo scents. There's several reasons for that. Number one, the ones that were developed in the 70s by Sigma, cadaverine and putrescine, is found in every decomposing animal. So if you train your dog on that, they're going to hit other things. That's a problem in our court system, so we don't do that. Now, the dog that we're talking about tonight, Rip, who is a third generation, the dog that I showed you at the beginning, Pete, this is his granddaughter, and she was trained completely different than my other cadaver dogs and my team's other cadaver dogs. She actually was started on whole bodies at Texas State when she was a puppy. She was introduced to real burials at FACS. Most of the time when people train burials, they dig a hole, 6 to 12 inches. They put some training aids down in it, usually not very much because they don't have very much. They put some leaf litter, rocks, a little bit of dirt back on it, and then call it good. And learned really quick after we started training dogs on bodies at facts that is in no way simulating a burial. And so you've got a whole industry that is training their dogs and testing their dogs incorrectly. Okay. Once we got finished introducing her to burieds at facts, we started training at Eloise Woods, which is a green cemetery outside of Bastrop. The owner there is very supportive of our training. We did try training with pieballs, and I'll talk about that if we have time, but we're not doing that anymore. I started taking her for fun, really, to do historic graves, pre-Civil War, 1800s, early 1900s. One of my mentors is from Idaho, she has worked a lot of burieds, frontier and Native American graves with her dogs over the years. And so I went and enjoyed working with her, but really was thinking that I was doing this to work on clandestine graves. We also trained her, like I trained my dogs on my team when we did our research projects for my master's and my Ph.D., to be able to detect the correct sample without a handler present with them, with a lineup like you see in the bottom pictures. Okay. Each one of those cans has various negative odors, and one can has a hot odor. Okay. And so she started working soils at an early age. Now, RIP has what we call a passive alert. Okay, dogs can have two types of alert. They can bark, they can do a refine, they can dig and scratch. Those are all what we call active alerts. Passive alerts would be a sit or down, which is a non-destructive alert. And this is RIP early on at a seminar in Arizona. Whoops. All right, go back. Come on, play for me. Here we go. Okay. So she's a baby. She's a baby there. She's learning. And I actually had someone else reward her so that she didn't become dependent upon me or my body language, thinking, okay, if he does a certain thing, then I should give my alert. Okay. Now, as we went along, we did more and more historic training. We went back to Arizona a couple more times, and these are all pictures of pioneer graves of her alerting on them. A lot of them were unmarked. The lady that was with us knew the area and had been out there with archaeologists and had everything mapped. So we knew where to reward our dogs and where not to. Turn the sound down on this because I sound goofy on it. Okay, this is RIP. I think this was last summer. Okay, working a single little tiny training aid. Once I started doing the archeologic stuff with her, I started dropping her threshold from whole bodies down to little bitty pieces of old training aids. Notice that I walk really slow with her because she's going to work basically where I'm at. If I wanted to move out and cover lots of ground, I would walk faster. If I wanted her to zigzag back and forth, we'd grid back and forth. But I shot this specifically for a presentation that Jennifer Anderson and I did last year. And if you watch her right there, she catches odor, starts to down, and she says, nope, I'm not right on it. And now she hits it down. If you also notice, she downed and then she looked at me, which means she decided for herself, this is it. And then she looked at me for her reward, which is what we want. We don't want them looking at us first. Okay. All right. So once this came to fruition in 2019, Dr. Westcott contacted me and asked me if I wanted to do some historic work. And I said, sure. She's done some historic training. Went to Corpus Christi and did our first mission. I did not know that we were actually working prehistoric. I probably wouldn't have gone had I known that. I didn't train for that. I don't believe in putting dogs in things you don't train for. But she actually found 2 burials down there. And then later that summer, we went to Odessa and she found some bone fragments out there. This would be earlier that year in an area that we worked between the two in East Texas. And these areas were all negative. But we did some training after we cleared it on these scrapes. So they asked me, can you teach her to work these scrapes and these ditches and tell us if there's anything here? So I said, well, yes, but we have to train for it. So what we started doing is we buried things in the walls and in the ground, and then I would let it sit and while they were doing other things, and then we'd go back and run them. The one on the far left, pretty easy. The one at the top right, pretty easy. One on the bottom right, we had to rehearse that a few times because that's really tight for a dog and it was over her head. And so she was initially a little bit unsure about it, but once I rewarded her one time down there, then she was fine with the trenches after that. But we do have problems training for archaeologic searches. If you remember, I said dogs are trained to find odor. Okay. The problem we have is we really don't have appropriate training aids for these guys to train them on. We don't know what they're smelling. Current research that VAS did shows that there's like 487 chemicals released during decomposition. We have no idea what's left in these old graves. No one has done any research on it. It really needs to be researched if we're going to continue to try to use dogs for this so that we know how to train them for it. The one thing that I have had problems with RIP since then that we have worked on is that it's really messed with what we call threshold. And threshold is kind of like the difference between dogs smell the world, we see the world. So if you look at a bottle of food coloring, they all pretty much look black. But if you put 1 drop in a cup of water, you get the true color. That's threshold for a dog's nose. Okay, the difference between 1 drop and a whole body. The other problem that we have, and we have to work on this when we're training just for contemporary searches for criminal cases. When we train, every training aid that's put out has fresh human odor associated with it. Even if we're wearing gloves, we're still shedding skin cells and off-putting gases and stuff when we plant the aids. And so that's part of the scent picture to them. So you have to get them out on enough stuff to where they start to learn your odor has nothing to do with it. And we do a lot of proofing where we put our odor on articles out that have no cadaver odor on them. And that's where the body farm has really been a big help, because those bodies are placed out and left, and people don't approach them very often. Students might come up every once in a while and take some readings on them, but they pretty much are there to decay naturally. Now, we did get to go twice to Caddo Mounds State Park and work RIP on the mound. And I worked her about a year apart. And the first time we went one direction, the second time we went the long direction around the backside and all the way around. And she was actually able to pinpoint where the curators told me, yeah, those are where the bodies are supposed to be. And they were polite and allowed us to do this because she has a passive alert. And honestly, I wouldn't want to do an aggressive alert dog on any of this. Having worked in criminal cases, I understand the importance of not disturbing scenes. And I am as skeptical as probably most of you guys. I did not believe once they told me how old the one in Corpus Christi was that there was any way she would be successful. I can't tell you what she's smelling. I think it's fat. I don't know for sure. We need to do research. But they're not a silver bullet, and they're not going to be successful in every situation. Okay? They can only train what they're fine to train, and soil conditions can really, really mess with their ability to find things. If you're working in a sandy soil or a sandy loam, they can detect odor, but it's hard for them to pinpoint. The wetter it is, the harder it is to pinpoint because the odor spreads. Okay? Chemicals spread in the ground. Weather can affect them. The hotter and the more humid it is, the less efficient their noses are. And you get above 85 degrees in Texas, and you start to put them at safety issues. Higher the humidity goes, the higher the heat goes, the more careful you've got to be. The lower the threshold becomes, which it gets really low when we're doing the archeologic stuff, you're going to get alerts and what I call drag residual. I've worked a couple of historic cases where they asked me how to do it. I said, don't do anything. And I got there and they had mulched the entire scene and drug wood all over. There was, it looked like somebody put all the trees to a pine chipper, and the odor was everywhere. So the dogs couldn't really pinpoint. Tires, backhoes, tracks, shovels on one of the searches that we went out on. She alerted on some flagging, the little flags that you stick in the ground. And of course, there were a couple of chuckles. And then one of the archaeologists said, what if there were bones previously in the container those flags were in, and the flags were in there with them? And I went, they would be contaminated. So you have to think about that too. We have to deal with contamination. What I can tell you though, is that when I did my research, we found that of the 10 dogs we used in the study, they could locate or properly indicate on surface decomp 2.5 years after a body had been removed. So the body was gone. They were still able to say, yeah, that's the correct soil. Unfortunately, I didn't get to do any longer than that because I ran out of money and my chair said I had to graduate. So let's see, I thought I had another video in here. Guess I don't. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, so does anybody have any questions? Stop the...
All right. Well,
quick question, if I can. To what depth can they determine? A normal modern grave is 6 feet. Can they determine that, or is there a limit? Do you have any research on that?
For modern graves, how deep?
Yeah, I mean, you know, modern grave is about 6 foot. So can the dog?
Oh yeah, yeah, they can do 6 foot without any problem.
Okay.
Yeah. The ones at the Green Cemetery in Bastrop vary in depth. They have them up to 6 feet, all the way down to they don't hardly bury them at all, and they mound rocks on top of them because sometimes the families bury them, and sometimes they actually hire the cemetery to put the bodies in. So.
Ben, I have a question for you. I'm very curious about the soil conditions because I'm working on a cemetery investigation upriver from New Orleans right now, actually. And I'm curious what sort of success you think you would have in like a very saturated clay environment.
How saturated? Are you talking like swamp?
So on the surface, there's some pockets of standing water, but after a couple, 2 to 4 feet, the water table starts seeping in. So I'd say, I describe it as pretty heavily saturated. So, but it's not really a swamp. It's not standing water above the surface.
They could probably tell you, yeah, there's something here. They might have a difficulty pinpointing when you get groundwater, because basically if you've got multiple graves in an area, the groundwater all becomes contaminated. And so they're like, okay, this whole area has dead people. Does that make
That could-
sense?
Yeah, for presence or absence, I think that could be very useful. So if a potential cemetery location, what would you, is it better to strip it slightly, or better to have like the surface undisturbed? I saw some of those historic cemeteries you showed, they had stripped it down. Is that a best practice or?
No, actually, it's better if you cannot disturb it to start with. That doesn't mean that you can't go back in and do some tests. And those weren't actually cemeteries, so that was for TxDOT. Those were right of ways along the roadways. So there was going to be a highway put in there, or an expansion of a highway put in. And so their, you guys probably know this, but their typical thing is to go in and do scrapes and do shovel tests. And so basically they were trying to see if she could save them time by, okay, we've done this one scrape. Can she run this field and check the scrape and tell us yes or no? And then we don't, you know, if she's successful, then maybe we can use dogs more often to save us time, save us labor, and so forth.
That's really interesting. Yeah, this has been absolutely fascinating. If Rip walked like an inundated ground surface and didn't have a positive hit, how confident would you be that there were no human burials there?
It would depend on the type of soil. If it was sand,
clay, what if it was clay?
clay, as long as I do my due diligence that I grit it tight enough, I would be pretty confident. If it's sand, I'm not that confident, and especially if it rains, because I know it can really dissipate the odor. But generally, if there's something there, the dogs are pretty good. Well-trained dogs, well-certified dogs are pretty good about saying, yes, there's something here, no, there's not. The problem we get into with graves is when you've got multiple graves, having them be able to go, there's a grave here, and there's a grave here, and there's a grave here, and there's a grave here, because that's not what we train for. We train for clandestine graves. We typically don't get to work serial killers. So, you know, we have one grave or one person that we're looking for. We're not going out looking for 10, 15, 20, 30, 50 graves. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So what is it about the sandy soils that make you less confident exactly?
Because they drain better than clay does.
That makes sense.
And so clay is going to hold, like you said, your water table, without getting into the whole chemistry part of the soil, the clay particles adheres ions and cations that are being released from chemicals. Okay, so it's going to hold the odor there. That makes it harder for them to be able to go into an area and go, oh yeah, I've got odor. You've got to be very diligent and cover the area very well to make sure that they get their nose over where the odor is. With sand, if it's rained, they can tell you there's something there, but they can't pinpoint it. If it's dry, then most of what decomped has drained away. So it makes it very hard.
That makes sense. Thank you. Thank you very much. It's very interesting.
Subsoil also has something to do with it. So you can have a sandy topsoil. If you've got a clay bottom, then you might be more successful. But if it's sand all the way, then you're not going to have much success.
Interesting.
Is there I was going to just jump in here. Is there a difference in the way they might detect bodies that are in caskets or some kind of a box as opposed to those that are just buried without that? I mean, does the stuff that they're surrounded in affect in any way the way they react or what they actually are being able to smell?
Well, are you talking about like bodies that are embalmed?
Well, yeah. Or
Okay.
yeah. Or some.
I'll be honest with you, we won't work our dogs on embalmed bodies because of the potentiality for nasal cancers from all the formaldehydes and stuff. And honestly, we don't need to, because if they're a clandestine grave, people don't embalm somebody they've murdered. So, and most of the historic graves, if you're going before 1900, they're not going to be embalmed. So we don't really have to worry about. Wood boxes usually have dilapidated and, you know, broken up. The older the grave is, the less likely there's going to be any kind of structure remaining. I don't know. Y'all might be able to tell me differently. But that's just been my experience so far. And I'm going to admit, I'm a baby in this. This is all new. I am learning. And I keep saying that every time we go out the door, we're going to learn things that we don't know, that we didn't know after we work this site.
Yeah, Ben, the soil conditions are going to really determine what's left of the casket. But yeah, frequently, you know, 19th century burials, there's going to be usually pretty little of the casket left, and what you'll still have the shaft and the hardware, but most of the coffin wood is going to be completely gone. You may have some random pieces, but a lot of it's going to be decomped entirely.
And, you know, if you guys have any opportunities for us to come train, I will come and help you for free to get training on her so that we can be more assistance to people. So.
Well, I'll definitely shoot you an email, Ben, because I
Okay.
may have an opportunity for you.
Okay. All right.
Hey, Ben,
Mhm.
in the 19th century, they sometimes used arsenic in preserving bodies. Do you ever run across that? And is that a health hazard for the dogs?
I haven't run across it to my knowledge. I would think arsenic would only be a health hazard if they chewed on something. I could be wrong about that and might be something that I need to look into. But with the formaldehyde, and it may not be an issue with formaldehyde, but the other thing is that we wouldn't really get an opportunity to work embalmed bodies. The last thing that I want to do is take my dog to a big cemetery, because it's like, think about when you get on an elevator with someone that has too much cologne and the door's shut and you can't get away from them. Okay. You have the same effect. I've taken Rip to big cemeteries because they had old graves, and I thought that'd be great. I'll work her on the old graves. And she just kind of spun in circles. Like, I don't know what to do. I don't know. It's everywhere. It's everywhere. And so I went, this is not successful. This is not going to work. We'll go back to the graves at although every once in a while we can find old graves that there's only maybe like a handful. That's good. Actually, in my hometown where I live right now, there's a single grave. And I've worked her on it twice, and it was pretty amazing to watch her work it. It's in the middle of town. They had a freedman's slave cemetery there. And at the turn of the last century, I guess in the 1920s, they moved the cemetery because people were building homes and stuff in that part of the town. And that family refused. They said, we're not moving her. And so they just bricked a little area, put a tree beside her, and put the road around her. But it's in a very slow, quiet neighborhood. And I've worked Rip on it from about 2 blocks away, and she didn't have any problem locating it. So.
All right. Well, I'm not seeing any questions in chat. I have a question or two. I was curious, you know, back to facts and Texas State. Do you have a series of colleagues who are also working with canines as part of your team there?
Well, we actually just started a mass grave project. In the first slide, or one of the early slides, there's a picture of Andrea Pinter and her dog over in Europe, and that's what they're doing. They're working on a lot of mass graves over there, from like I guess World War I and earlier. And so we're working on that with Dr. Sherry Forbes and Jonathan, I can't remember his last name, from England. So it's kind of an international crew. But the staff that does the actual training for the seminars, we're all volunteers. Because most search and rescue people are, well, all search and rescue handlers are volunteers. They don't get paid for it, and they pay out a lot out of their pocket. When I was actively going out in the field constantly for sheriff's counties, their sheriff's offices and stuff, I probably spent about $10,000 a year. So Dr. Westcott tries to keep the cost down so that handlers can afford to come, and the instructors and all the staff that work the seminars, they do it for free. They're usually fellow handlers or retired handlers that have come to value and understand that the dogs are not, they're just not very good without putting them on whole bodies. All the dogs in our seminars have to be certified with an agency. And we found out really quickly that that doesn't necessarily mean they can find a body. Probably about 75% of the dogs at every seminar would walk right past the bodies on the first day, like they're not even there, because they're used to training on something about this big. And so a body has a different odor. Dr. Ken Furton down at FIU has done research where they took tissue from a large section and took gases, put it under mass spec, and then they would take a little subsection of it and take gases. And they actually got a different fingerprint between the whole chunk and the little chunk, which means that what the dogs are smelling aren't necessarily the same. So that's probably more information than you wanted.
No, that's great. I appreciate it. So Dr. Alexander, there's a couple questions over here in chat. I'll just read the first one there. I know you can see it, but as far as year round, how much time do you spend training the dogs to go on a few hunts?
I train at least twice a week, every week, sometimes more. Depends on what I'm doing and what is involved. In the wintertime, I tend to train more than I do in the summertime because it just gets so hot. But I'm in the process of training Rip's next compadre. And so I'm working a lot with him right now to get him ready to go.
All right, thank you. And then the next question, have you had better results when the soil is more moist rather than very dry? And have you ever aerated an area that you needed to work?
It depends on what type of soil it is, whether if it's a sandy soil and it's a contemporary grave, honestly, I would rather it be wet because I can get in the general area and then I can let the investigators do the rest. It's been a little detrimental on this archeologic stuff because we found that the chemicals can travel quite a ways down slope from like a burial mound. So that's been a little bit of a problem in sandy soils. Clay soils, if they're dry, you may get cracks in the soil, which then is going to give you some really nice aeration. When clay is really, really wet, if you don't have wormholes and seeps, it's going to be harder for the dog to locate it. As far as warmth, most people prefer the soil warm up. So kind of in Texas, it becomes a real catch-22. You want to get out early in the summertime before it gets too hot, but you want the soil to warm up a little bit and the microbes to wake up. And in terms of looking for like mass burials, like large graveyards, I have learned through some of my mentors that it's really best done in the springtime if there are trees in the area when the trees are starting to sprout, because the trees pick something up. I don't know what it is, but when you get a dog in an area where there are burieds, those dogs start going up the trees.
All right, well, we've got another question there. How long do these searches take on average?
it depends on how big the area is and how thick the undercover and stuff is. It can take all day. Or we could be finished in half an hour. It's really hard to put a time on that. It's all topography, vegetation, time of year, time of day.
And then a question, how do you know the team handling the dogs is properly trained?
You test them. No, seriously, you test them. So for 16 years, I ran a team that went out for law enforcement quite frequently. We did a lot of drowning recoveries, a lot of criminal cases. And when we got to it, it didn't matter how they'd been doing in training. When we got to the search, I usually had something that was appropriate, handed it to law enforcement, had them place the training aid, ran the dogs. If a dog failed to indicate the source correctly, independently of its handler, dog went back in the truck. They're like we are. There is no dog that's perfect. They have bad days. The male that I showed you had 10 drowning recoveries in his career. He never missed a body on a lake. But there were times that I had to put him up. We had somebody show up with a female in heat one time and forget it. He wasn't going to work. So you test them.
All right. Well, I don't see any more questions in chat. Do we have any more questions on the floor?
Well, I was going to write something in chat. I was just curious, for how long has this practice of using, these dogs for using any kind of archaeological remains, and especially prehistoric remains, been going on? Is it widespread across the country? And I know this is a lot all in one hand, but have there been any reactions, good, bad, or otherwise, among any sites that might have involved Native American remains?
Okay. Yeah. So yeah, there actually is a group out in California. It's Canine Forensic Institute, I think, or Forensic Canine Institute, something like that. And they've been doing it for many years. They've worked a lot of cases, some successfully, some unsuccessfully. But again, there's so many factors that factor into this that you can't say the dogs are bad just because they missed something one place. It could have been the conditions, the soil, the topography, whatever. Bad choice of when they put the dogs out. And sometimes you don't have a choice. Sometimes you have to go when they ask you to go, and make the best of it. Andrea Pinter in Europe has been doing this for about 5 years now, and you can Google her. She's been very successful at finding extremely old graves. And Andrea and I talk quite often. And I will tell you that one of the first questions I asked her, I was like, how are you training them? Because I'm having problems with a threshold. She goes, oh, well, whenever we do a site, the anthropologists, they drop a few bones in a jar for me, date it and label it, and I go home and train on it. And I'm like, yeah, that doesn't happen in the United States. And she couldn't wrap her head around that. So I was like, yeah, I can't, no, that doesn't happen. Probably the best that I've got right now is stuff that came from the bone room that may be 60, 70 years old, maybe. But the problem that we get into there is that we don't know if the bone's been bleached or treated or whatever. And I don't handle it with bare hands, but who knows how many people did before I got it. What was the last part of your question?
Well, I was curious about, how widespread it is. You've kind of addressed all of that. The only last question I had was about the reaction of Native American groups. And I think you've inadvertently addressed that one as well. I was curious about good, bad, or otherwise, if, how do they handle it?
It's actually been really good so far. When I did the one in Corpus Christi, that was the first one I did. There was actually a representative from whatever the council is for the state of Texas. and she followed me around. She stayed about 20 feet behind me. She never said anything to me, but she watched the entire time. And the archaeologist, on the other hand, was not happy I was there, did not want to listen to anything I said. Fortunately, there was a second archaeologist who was writing everything down, and turned out that Rip was right. So the lady from the council was very happy because they see it as a non-invasive tool so that their ancestors are not disturbed. So I think they're pretty supportive, but that's that one group. I don't know how it's going to transfer. I am in the process right now of negotiating to go to Alaska to go work some grounds that was a Indian Bureau boarding school. The land now belongs to the city, and the city wants to do stuff with it, but the mayor, who happens to run Cadaver Dogs, knows that there is a graveyard out there, and he's not going to let them do any building on it until we determine where it is and properly mark it. So.
All right, well, we've got some more here. Let me ask Katrina to ask her question. She's got her hand raised.
I was just going to address, Tim was asking how long, people have been doing this, looking for like really old remains. And Bill Tolhurst back in the 70s, he was one of the first guys that was training cadaver dogs. His little chocolate lab candy bar, she located a Civil War grave, and they didn't know that it was even there. She just did an alert on it, and they started digging and found it there. So, people have been working on these techniques for many, many years. Just as a sidebar. Yeah. I mean, this is not a new thing, and technology, thank God, is growing with all of this and finding out more about what does work, and a little bit more about why it works. This is, we've been working for this, like, don't know why it works, but they do hit on certain things. So yeah, that was all.
Oh, thank you. No, I know who Bill Tolhurst is, but I'm a little bit too young to have known him personally, but he's quite a legend.
Yeah, unfortunately, I did train under him. My husband and I both did. So yeah, he was very, very good. Very good. So anyway, I'm done.
So we've got a couple more here, and Zach's got some more questions. So Ben, have you had state archaeologists and SHPOs approve these methods? Are there published materials you could point us to? Also, what's your preferred contact?
The first answer would be no. I had talked to TxDOT about getting some stuff written up, and then COVID hit. And everything came to a screeching halt. And one of the things that I've reminded them lately is that, because they're like, oh, well, next year. And I'm like, next year she'll be 8 years old. Dogs don't live forever. That's why I'm working on bringing the next dog up, but there's no guarantee that he will be as good as she is, or that he will be able to do that kind of work. I was shocked she could do it. They're kind of like we are, dogs. They have their, I'm not a good math student, but I'm really good in history and English and writing. There are some dogs that are really good at graves. There are some dogs that aren't. Her granddad was outstanding at water recovery. He was a mediocre land cadaver dog. He did great in disasters. He did good in things where the odor could permeate better.
And then maybe part of that question is, what's your preferred contact?
Oh, email. You can email me. Yeah. So.
And so
Good.
Next question from Stephen Chapman. How deep was the water, and how large were the lakes where your dog located the bodies?
Let's see. Most of the lakes in Texas, well, I say that, and they're not all. Some of the lakes in Texas are fairly shallow. The oldest one that we ever located had been down 31 days. That was up on Ray Hubbard in Dallas in the winter. It was 40 degrees and the body basically was like refrigerated, and so it didn't float. Most of the time in Texas in the summertime, game wardens don't call in cadaver dog teams unless the body doesn't float within 72 hours. Then they start to go, they're hung up. Okay, bring the dogs in. Or if the family is an important family and they start screaming at the press involved. And the reason for that is because they've been burned a lot by dogs that are not adequate. Texas doesn't have state standards. So that means that anybody can go to the pound, grab a dog, slap a vest on it, and show up at a search. We don't have county teams like California or Virginia. So we're not very regulated, and so that can cause problems. But the deepest probably would have been on Lake Travis, out in the main channel. I think Lake Travis in some portions is like 180 feet deep when it's full. So that would have been the deepest one. The rest of them were 40 feet, 15, 20 feet.
Thank you, Dr. Alexander. I don't see any more questions in chat. One more call on the floor. Any questions from the floor? Okay, well, Dr. Alexander, that's fascinating, fascinating program, and thank you. I certainly enjoyed it. I know our members enjoyed it, and we really appreciate your time. And I want to thank everybody for being here tonight, and y'all have a great evening. I will see you all next month, and remember that next month we are going to be virtual, not in person. That's the way that we're leaning right now for the executive committee, so just keep that in mind. So y'all have a good night. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.